Next we can go through auto wiring concept, which is a main concept in the Spring Boot applications, web service applications. It is a feature of Spring IOC container that allows dependencies to be automatically injected into our Spring managed beans, that is Spring managed base classes. Base classes in the sense almost all classes, not actual base class in the object-oriented programming, Spring manager beans. This helps it is easier to manage dependencies and promote loose coupling between the components, so which can be managed easily. Auto wiring is done in based on the concept of dependency injection, where we know that dependency injection is the injection of the dependencies to our applications at runtime. This allows beans to collaborate with each other without having to create or manage their dependencies manually. Next comes the injection points. That is where this auto wiring can be used along with the dependency injection, where this injection can be injected. Mainly three component parts, like in the constructor area, in the setter side, and in the fields of the classes. Next, there are three types of auto wiring modes based on the position where the dependency can be injected, like constructor auto wiring, setter auto wiring, and field auto wiring. Constructor auto wiring automatically identifies the constructor with the greatest number of arguments and attempt to match the type of this argument with the available beans in the container. Next comes the setter auto wiring. Springs look for the setter methods annotated with the auto wire annotation, and if find with that, it will be set for auto wiring. That setter will be auto wired. From this we can know that the annotation used for auto wiring is at auto wired. Next comes the field auto wiring. Field auto wiring is used to auto wiring the classes beans class for fields, which is annotated with that auto wired annotation, and inject the corresponding beans to that. Next we can discuss the annotations used for this auto wiring, for achieving the auto wiring. Main one is as the name suggests, auto wire itself, used to auto wire the components. Next comes a qualifier. Qualifier is used with the auto wire property to specifies the name of the beam to be injected, especially when there is multiple beans are available. We have mentioned earlier in the annotation section. Next comes a resource annotation. Resource annotation is Java EE standard for resource injection and the Spring Boot application. It is also a component related to automatic wiring of the auto wiring concept. Next comes the automatic bean discovery, that is automatic Java class discovery. This includes the beans defining configuration classes and the component scanning packages, and the bean registered through other mechanisms such as component scanning and import method will be auto wired to the application context. That is meant by automatic bean discovery. Next is the API. What is API endpoint, and what are the best practices to be kept in mind while defining the API endpoints. In Spring Boot, API endpoints definition involves mapping the HTTP request to the specific method or functions in the Spring Boot application. That is a method that handles the business logic, which work according to the response from my server, and all will be annotated with the API endpoints or request mapping annotation and all. In such cases, the API endpoint definition come into account. The best practices to kept for or be followed while defining API endpoints is that first one is use RESTful principle. RESTful principles in the sense to defines us to use the HTTP standard HTTP methods like get, post, put, and delete. perform the CRUD operation to avoid exposing the implementation details in the URL structure. Also keep a consistent naming convention that all the programmer must have to be done in the same sense. In the API also we need to consider the meaningful names and descriptive names for each API endpoint. Next comes the versioning. It is a good method to keep track of the version or mention the version of the API in the API in the URL path to identify the version of the API. Next, we can use path variables or query parameters to pass value to our endpoints for computing anything using any values, dynamic values. We can pass through the URL for API endpoint. One method is the using path variable. Other method is using query parameter. And next is the following of data formats for the request and response, which makes it easier for clients to understand the API. Next comes error handling. To handle the errors while hitting the API, for documentation or for exception handling must be done. This must include handling, writing error messages, and having additional details in the response code for user troubleshooting from the developer side. Next comes the security. Security is authentication of this API. A validation of API is also a main point. And in Spring Boot, security for API can be achieved using Java Web Token JWT or using auth services. Next comes the validation. Validation means implementing the validation to ensure the clients to provide valid data to our API endpoints, and the data passing to our API endpoints when there is a need to have a beautiful working of the system, we need to ensure the data parameters or the data going through the URL and all. So valid value must be passed through. It comes under this is mentioned in the validation section. Next is the documentation. For every API there must be documentation. Then only the API used by the client could know about what is that API for and how it can be achieved. Most commonly used documentation software or tools are Swagger, OpenAI for the REST APIs. It provides information about endpoint URLs, support HTTP method, response or request formats, parameters, examples like request and response. This comes the testing of the API. And the API also there is a need of testing, several type of testing, unit testing, integration testing. To cover different aspects of our API, it must be done using the allowed most widely accepted packages from the supported by the Spring Boot application. Next comes the scope section. Scope, as the name suggests, the region of availability of a particular stuff is referred to as scope. The Spring Boot concept, it is used to optimize resource usage, manage the states effectively, achieve the concurrency, and ensure that all the beans are created and destroyed in the appropriate context in our application. There are different types of scope: singleton scope, request scope, prototype scope. Like the different scope is there. Singleton scope is the means only single scope will be generated and the scope will be throughout the application. These are created once and the application starts up and are shared across multiple components throughout the application. Next comes the prototype scope. Prototype scope is used for the beans that need to be maintained state or have dependencies that change over the time. When the value changes during the different user session or data according to the request and response structure, and all are handled using the prototype scope. Next comes request scope, as the name suggests, when the request is made over the web controllers, The request and response scope for handling this will be available at the request. Request scope will be available at the time of the request creation and the request expiry. These are used for the beans that are specific to individual HTTP request and web application. Next comes the session scope. Session scope is used for beans that need to store and maintain session-specific data in web application. Session in the sense the logged in user authentication, user requirement and preferences, like that stuff has to be managed, and for managing that stuff we use the session scope. Application scope can be named also as global scope, that is the scope which is defined globally, which will have the access throughout the application context, which will be useful in for example of some global scope or application scope is the shared resources shared among the application, global configuration setting for the entire application wide services and all. Next comes the WebSocket scope. WebSocket scope is the scope used for beans that handle the WebSocket sessions and manage their logic. The components that come under the WebSocket scope is the WebSocket controllers, message handler, and session managers to handle the WebSocket connection. We can go through the parametric section of the how the scope can be used in our application. Mainly, as I previously mentioned, annotation is used to define something in everything in the Spring Boot application. For achieving the scope, we can use @scope annotation to specify the scope of bean directly in the bean class, and inside that scope as a parameter we can pass the type of scope. Other method is that we can configure the scope in the bean definition. You can configure the scope of a bean in the Spring configuration class or XML configuration file using the @bean annotation or the bean element, and after that we can define the scope. Next is the dynamic scoping, that is the scoping done at the runtime. We can also determine we can use the annotation like condition on property or condition on beam, etc. to programmatically create and register the bean definitions using bean definition registry at the runtime. Next comes the profiles section. Spring Boot application is divided into separate profiles. The main category of the profile, mainly the profile is something which provides a way to segregate the part of our application configuration and functionality based on the environment and different scenarios. There are different types of profiles: environment profile, cloud profile, functional profile, custom profiles, and several others. Environment profile in the sense, as a developer we have different environments to have that an application go through, that is development, testing, staging, and production. For each we can use separate profiles. In development profile we can configure relaxed security settings, verbose logging, and in-memory databases, whereas in test profiles we can configure include the configuration specific settings such as mocking external dependencies, mocking databases, embedding the mock database without use of expensive actual database and all. That is achieved using by building a test profile. Production profile is the profile that provided to the user, which can be which includes profiles that contains optimizing the performance, optimizing the code, increasing the performance, reducing the necessary computation, and all. Connection pooling, caching, and error monitoring, and logging, and all. This has to be more strictly coupled in the production profile, so such profile can be built for the production profile. Next comes the custom profile. Custom profile, if the standard profiles if the standard profile other than the standard profiles need to be built, like pre-production testing or pre-production routine checkup and all, we can configure separate profiles where we can customize the configuration the different variants as manually. So such the custom profiles can be built if the standard profiles does not meet the specific requirement. Like profile, we can separately provide the profile for staging, quality analysis testing, user acceptance testing, AIB testing, and several pre-production and environment testing and all. Which next comes the cloud profile. As in the new era, as we store our data and all on the cloud platforms like AWS, Google Cloud Platform, Azure, and all, we need to configure them to our application to access their services and all, to access their database, to access their platform, to access their software, to access their infrastructure and all. So we can so there is cloud provider profiles to provide support for profile specific cloud platforms. This includes configuration for respective cloud storage such as database connection, messaging service, and storage option. The Spring one of the cloud other variant of cloud profile is that Spring Cloud Profile, that is the cloud profile of the Spring itself. Spring Cloud is an extension of the Spring framework, which for building distributed systems. The Spring also provides their own native profile. These profiles include the feature for service discovery, distributed configuration, circuit breakers, and distributed tracing. For this, a different profile can be built and used. Next comes the functional profile. Functional profiles are the profiles used for achieving the third-party or external functionality. Like some of them are integration profile and monitoring profile. Integration profile is used for integrating profiles that can be managed while we integrate third-party applications like payment gateways, message OTP configure messaging service, Google authentication service, Google authentication service without that overrides manual authentication and all. Or analytic profile like that, while using that like that integration profile, we can make use of the functional profile. And also on the while monitoring, like logging, keep tracking of the system, monitoring the system for logging purpose, and we can use the separate profiles other than the normal and non profiles and all. So that is the profiles of the Spring Boot application. Next comes the Swagger. As we said that a proper documentation must be provided for the generated API from the service providers or the server. So how that is achieved through Swagger. Swagger mainly act as a documentation, but and also provides the tester UI interface to test the client application. When a service is provided by a service provider, REST API, REST client when access that API, it must have the right to know how this API is being implemented, as it is developed by another developer and we are making use of the service. We need to know how to make use of the service, and proper documentation must be there. It is mainly achieved in today's world using the Swagger, mainly using Swagger documentation. Swagger is a general documentation for REST API. Swagger UI is also helps to test the REST API. It is more advantageous over the Postman application. Using the Swagger documentation, the REST client can be developed. The Swagger file can be auto-generated from the code annotation using the use case class definition on a lot of different platforms. when we change in the code, the same change will be reflected in the Swagger UI also.